My name is Eric Raymond. I'm 34 years old, and I've been working as a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for almost a decade. It's a job that, for most people, might seem monotonous. Long patrols, filling out reports on blocked trails, or interacting with tourists who can't tell the difference between a bear and an elk. But for me, it's more than just a job. It's a refuge. I've always been more comfortable with the sound of wind in the trees than with office conversations or crowded parties. I grew up in a small town in Montana, where the biggest event of the year was the county fair. My father was a lumberjack, and my mother worked at a local warehouse. When they passed away, 5 years apart, Yellowstone became the place where I could feel I still had a connection to them. They loved nature, and being there, surrounded by forests and mountains, just felt right. My routine is simple. I wake up early, make a strong cup of coffee, and review the day's schedule. Depending on the week, I might be assigned to check trails or accompany researchers. Sometimes I stay at the central station, handling the frequent calls from unaware visitors who think they can camp without a permit. That week, however, something felt different. It was early September, the time of year when the park starts to empty out. Summer had already passed, and tourists were returning to their cities. I usually enjoyed this period. The trails became quiet, and the park seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But this time, there was something I couldn't identify. My first task that morning was to check a little used trail in the northern section of the park, near a place called Devil's Ridge. It's a steep section with few campgrounds and known for sudden storms that discourage even the most experienced hikers. When I got there, everything seemed normal, except for one detail. I found a dead deer just a few meters off the trail. Nothing unusual, I thought immediately. Animals die all the time, whether from disease, predation, or accidents. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The body was intact, with no signs of attack or visible injuries. There were no bite marks or scratches, and the smell was wrong. I grabbed my radio and called Scott, my supervisor. Scott, it's Eric. I found a dead deer on the Devil's Ridge Trail. No signs of predation, but the condition of the body is strange. Strange how? He replied with his usual drawl. No external injuries. It just seems like it dropped dead. All right. I'll note it down. Take some photos and log it in the report. It could be disease or something like that. Maybe the biologist will want to take a look. I did as he asked, but the feeling that something wasn't right lingered with me. Even after years of working in the park, I had never seen anything like this. Not with an animal that size. I continued with my day, trying to forget about it. I got back to the central station around PM and spent the rest of the shift checking camping permits and answering questions from tourists. It was a typical afternoon until I received a call that, at the time, seemed harmless. Central Station. This is Eric Raymond. How can I help? Hi, I'm Jessica Morgan. I'm camping near Yellowstone Lake. I know it's probably nothing, but we haven't seen any squirrels or birds around here. Is that normal? Yeah, that's normal. Some days can feel quieter depending on the weather or animal activity. But if anything seems off, let me know, okay? All right. Just thought it was a little strange. Thanks. When I hung up, the call stuck with me. It wasn't uncommon for animals to temporarily move away from certain areas, but the complete absence of wildlife in a place like that wasn't normal. I decided to log the report, just in case. That night, while reviewing the reports in the system, I remembered the deer at Devil's Ridge. The two things weren't related, of course, but for some reason, that thought kept bothering me. I knew something was changing in the park, I didn't know it yet, but the signs were there. The next morning, I arrived at the central station a little earlier than usual. The sun was just rising, and the air had that fresh pine smell that only Yellowstone can offer. The room was empty except for Scott, who seemed more interested in his coffee mug than any conversation. "I saw your report on the deer," he commented without looking up from his computer. "The biologists will take a look tomorrow, all right," I replied as I put my backpack on the table. "Anything else?" "Nothing urgent. Just a blocked trail near the South Canyon. Looks like a log fell. Is it you or Tom today?" "I can take care of it," Scott nodded, and the conversation ended there. Working with him was like that. Few words, a practical and efficient manner. He was the kind of guy you trusted to have your back in tough situations, but he rarely shared more than necessary. As I was getting ready to leave, Tom showed up. He was the opposite of Scott, talkative, energetic, and sometimes a bit annoying. "Hey, Eric, I heard about the deer." "Strange, huh?" he said, throwing his backpack on the floor. "Maybe some weird ritual. You know, those cult stories?" "There was no ritual, Tom. It just seemed dead, no explanation." Okay. But if you start finding more of these, let me know. Maybe we've got a forest mystery on our hands." I rolled my eyes, but couldn't help but smile a little. Tom had a peculiar way of turning anything into a joke, even if he sometimes crossed the line. Throughout the day, the blocked trail turned out to be more work than I expected. The log was big, and I had to use heavy tools to remove it. While working, I noticed something. The place was incredibly quiet. No birds or squirrels. It was as if the whole forest had stopped to watch. After finishing the work, I stopped for lunch right there, sitting on a rock with a view of the canyon. That's when I heard footsteps. I looked up, expecting to see some lost visitor, but there was no one. "Anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. Silence. I shrugged it off and finished my lunch. I'd been in situations like this before. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in nature. Back at the station, I found Tom fiddling with the radio. He seemed more serious than usual. "We got another strange call." "Strange how?" "Remember the woman from Yellowstone Lake? Now it's a guy camping in the same area. He said his dog disappeared. It ran after something, and puff, just vanished." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept calm. Maybe the dog got lost. That happens all the time, maybe. But he swore he didn't see or hear anything after the dog ran. Nothing. It's like the dog just disappeared into thin air. Tom was probably exaggerating, as usual, but something in his voice bothered me. I decided to leave a little early that day. I stopped by the local market to buy some things and ran into Nancy, an old friend. She ran a souvenir shop near the park and always had a story to tell. "Eric, you look terrible," she teased, pushing a coffee pack toward me. "Tough day at work?" "Something like that." "Weird week." "Really?" I hesitated for a moment, but decided to ask. "Have you heard anything about animals disappearing around here? I mean, more than usual." Nancy stopped, her expression turning serious. "Not since." "Well, a few years ago. But it was in the northern section, near Devil's Ridge. What happened?" "Some tourists said the area felt empty. No animals, no noise. Some thought it was just paranoia, but the local guides stopped taking groups there for a while. The information stayed in my head for the rest of the night. When I got home, I opened my logbook and started listing the events of the past few days. The deer, the unusual silence, the reports from visitors. It was just a coincidence, right? Still, I had the feeling that something was connecting all of this. 2 days later, I was assigned to patrol the southern area of the park, where the incidents with the deer and the missing dog had occurred. The weather was overcast, with little sunlight piercing through the treetops. It was the kind of day that made the park feel bigger, more isolated. I started the hike early, checking trails and campgrounds. There was something strange about the area, but I couldn't quite place it. The air felt thicker, and the absence of wildlife sounds was beginning to get to me. Around noon, I noticed marks on the ground. Barefoot human footprints were following an irregular path through the forest. I grabbed my radio. "Scott, this is Eric. I found something strange in the south sector. Human footprints. Doesn't look like something visitors would leave." The radio crackled for a few seconds before he responded. "Footprints? Are you sure they're not from a lost camper?" "I'm not sure. I'm following the trail. I'll keep you updated." As I followed the footprints, I noticed something even weirder. They started off strong and distinct, but gradually became lighter, as if the person was disappearing or floating. I continued for about half an hour until I reached a clearing. In the center, there was something that made my stomach drop. A small pile of bones. All clean, with no sign of flesh or blood. I grabbed my radio again, but before I could speak, I heard a low, deep hum coming from the trees around me. It was like a buzzing, almost imperceptible, but unbearably constant. "Scott?" I called, my voice louder than necessary. The radio responded with static. "Scott, can you hear me?" Nothing. I put the radio away, pulled out my flashlight, and started inspecting the bones more closely. They weren't from a large animal, but they weren't small either. A young deer, maybe? The buzzing grew louder. I looked around, trying to identify the source, but it seemed to be coming from all directions. That's when I saw something move between the trees, too fast to be an animal. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the clearing. No response. I stood up and started backing toward the trail. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. The sound stopped. I ran. I didn't think twice. I didn't know what was happening, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. Back at the station, I told Scott and Tom everything. They exchanged glances, but neither of them seemed to know what to say. Bones? In the south clearing? Scott finally broke the silence. "That doesn't make sense. We've never had problems in that area before." Tom tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's just a wolf or coyote playing a trick on us." "They weren't wolves, Tom," I replied flatly. "That was different." Scott sighed and stood up. "I'll log this, but keep the description vague. The last thing we need is curious tourists." "Fine," I replied, though I wasn't convinced. That night, I stayed up late, trying to make sense of what was going on. I decided to review the park's old records, something I didn't usually do. I found a reference to an incident in the 90s, reports of disappearances in the same area. There were vague mentions of anomalies in the ecosystem and reports from rangers hearing inexplicable sounds. The strangest part was a final note stating that the case was archived and the documents had been transferred to administrative maintenance. The next day, I went back to the clearing, this time with Tom. He made jokes the whole way, but when we got there, he fell silent. "Not exactly what I expected," he muttered, watching the bones on the ground. "And what did you expect?" "I don't know. Something more. Bloody." While Tom took pictures, I heard the hum again. "Do you hear that?" Tom frowned, tilting his head. "What?" "The hum." He shook his head. "No man? Just the silence." The sound was there, clear as day to me, but apparently not to him. That's when I felt something, like a presence behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. "Eric?" Tom asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing. Let's get out of here." As we walked back, Tom seemed uncomfortable, though he wouldn't admit it. "Do you think this has anything to do with those old stories?" he asked. "What stories?" "You know, the missing rangers." "I always thought they were just legends." I looked at him but didn't say anything. Deep down, I was starting to think maybe it wasn't just a legend. In the following days, things started to get even stranger. Tom's behavior changed, and I began to notice small inconsistencies in his actions. Something was different, but he was trying to hide it. Every time we talked about the incident in the clearing, he seemed to avert his gaze, as if he was hiding something. One afternoon, while we were passing by the park's small radio station, I saw Tom talking to an old acquaintance, Mike, the technician who took care of the security cameras. The conversation seemed casual, but there was a tension in the air. "Tom, do you know Mike?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation back to normal. He forced a smile. "Oh yeah, just asking about the camera maintenance. Nothing to worry about." Mike looked at me, and something in his eyes made my stomach turn. He didn't say anything, but his gaze seemed heavier than it should have been. In the following days, I started noticing more strange things. Every now and then, I'd feel like I was being watched, but when I turned around, there was no one there. Then, that same week, a storm hit the park, forcing everyone to take shelter at the central station. As everyone settled in, Scott started talking about an old story that involved the park. He seemed hesitant, like he was carefully choosing his words. "Eric, have you ever heard of the Forest Guardian?" he asked, taking a sip of coffee. I stayed silent, waiting for more details. "The Guardian?" I repeated, not understanding. "Well, it's not something that's talked about much, but in the past, there were reports of a spirit, or something like that." I realized he was more nervous than usual. This wasn't like Scott. He'd always been a man of few words, but never this uncomfortable. "A spirit? Are you serious?" Scott sighed, looking out the window as if searching for the right words. "I don't know, but they say the spirit of a dead ranger haunts the park from time to time. I've seen 1 or 2 reports where rangers talk about seeing things, hearing voices, or even feeling a strange presence. They tried to hide it from management, but I don't know. Sometimes I think there's more to it." The tension in the air was palpable. It was like everyone in the room was more on edge than before. Tom, who had stepped away to look out the window, took a step toward the conversation. He seemed distant, his gaze fixed more on the landscape than on the discussion. "Scott, do you really believe that? A spirit? That sounds like something out of a movie." Scott shrugged, but the discomfort was still evident. "I don't know, Tom, but there's strange stuff happening here. We can't just ignore it." It was at that moment that something in the conversation hit me. It wasn't just the spirit or the park. It was Mike. Something about the conversation between him and Tom wasn't sitting right with me. That night, I went back to the radio station, still trying to figure everything out. When I walked in, Mike was there again, fiddling with some equipment. When he saw me, he gave a nervous smile. "Eric, you again. What are you doing here so late?" The conversation he'd had with Tom still bothered me. Something was wrong. "Just checking if the cameras are working fine. Everything good here?" He looked at the monitors, visibly uncomfortable. "Yeah, everything's fine," Mike replied quickly, avoiding eye contact. I approached one of the monitors and noticed something strange, a blurry image from the camera near the southern clearing. It looked like someone was there, but it was impossible to make out. Mike noticed and quickly tried to turn off the screen. "Don't worry about that, Eric. It's just a camera glitch." I went up to the screen and saw enough to know this wasn't just a glitch. It was something else. "This doesn't look like a glitch, Mike. This is someone." He bit his lip and looked at me, finally allowing himself to be vulnerable. "It's nothing, Eric. You shouldn't worry about it. What are you trying to hide?" Mike hesitated, and at that moment, I knew something more was going on. He didn't want me to know what was happening in the park, and now I was more certain than ever that he was involved in some way. And then, that night, when I went back to my room and reflected on everything, things started to fall into place. The conversation between Mike and Tom, Scott's strange behavior, and the old records about disappearances. It seemed like there was something much bigger going on there than anyone was trying to hide. The weight of those discoveries consumed me more and more. Every corner of the park seemed to have hidden secrets, and the most recent one was starting to become clear. Mike, Scott, and Tom seemed involved in something, but what exactly was so serious that everyone was trying to hide it? The next morning, the pressure was unbearable. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. The pieces were fitting together, but something was still missing. I needed to know more, investigate further. I couldn't just keep being a passive observer in this story. It was then, during a regular patrol, that something happened that pulled me out of my thoughts. I was on the East Trail, near an old equipment shed, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a distant, muffled sound, as if someone was trying to call me, but the words were indistinct, almost incomprehensible. The wind was strong that day, so I thought it was just the storm's noise still echoing in the forest. However, as I got closer, the sound grew louder. It was no longer the wind. It was a voice. I couldn't make out exactly what it was saying, but the fear took over me. My heart raced, and my steps slowed. When I finally reached the entrance to the shed, everything seemed normal at first glance. There was no one there. No sign that anyone had been through. But when I looked at the ground, I noticed something strange. Footprints, not from boots, but from something much stranger. They seemed to be made by something large, but with an irregular pattern. The kind of thing you see in horror movies, but never imagine finding for real. I took a deep breath, trying to control my anxiety, but the footprints led through the trees, disappearing toward the north. Fear was consuming me, but something inside urged me to follow. And that's what I did. The trail was narrow and winding, covered with dense vegetation. As I moved forward, the feeling of being watched intensified. I wasn't alone anymore. Something was following me, lurking. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back now. I needed to understand what was happening, or I would never have peace. That's when I reached the turning point. In the middle of the trail, a small clearing opened up in front of me, and I saw something that I still can't quite describe. There was a figure in the center of the clearing, almost imperceptible, but with a presence that made my body tremble. It was a human shape, but not entirely human. The silhouette was distorted, as if it were constantly moving, changing shape. However, when I tried to get closer, the figure disappeared, as if it had dissolved into the air. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what I had just seen. My hands started to shake. What was that? A ghost? A hallucination? But the feeling that something very real had happened there was undeniable. Fear overtook me in a visceral way. With my heart racing and my blood chilled, I stepped back from the clearing and ran back to the central station. When I arrived, I found Tom. He looked worried, and a look of tension was plastered on his face. I couldn't hold it in. I had to speak. "Tom, I saw something. I don't know what it was, but..." It was there in the clearing. I don't know how to explain it. Tom looked at me, but didn't seem surprised. Something about that look made me even more suspicious. You shouldn't have gone there, Eric. You should have told me first. He took a step back, as if preparing to run away. Fear was palpable in his eyes. What are you trying to hide, Tom? I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head, desperate. We can't go on with this. I didn't want you to know. It was better if you hadn't seen anything. At that moment, the truth began to crash down on me like a ton of bricks. It was all connected. Tom knew everything. He wasn't surprised by what I had seen because he already knew what was going on. And that meant he was somehow involved in the mystery I was trying to solve. Before I could ask more questions, he interrupted me. You don't understand. You can't know everything. This isn't something we can fix, Eric. The tension between us was almost unbearable. I was about to confront him directly when, suddenly, Scott appeared at the door. His face was pale, and his eyes, usually calm, were now full of panic. He rushed into the room without saying a word. We have to go. Now, he said, his voice low and urgent. Whatever was happening, it had reached its limit. I knew, deep down, that whatever I had discovered was just the tip of the iceberg. The following days were complicated. I couldn't focus on my work anymore. I couldn't look at the park the same way. Every tree, every sound, every shadow seemed to have something more, something that no longer conveyed the peace it once did, something I didn't know if I was ready to discover. But by this point, I had no choice. Tom and Scott were more closed off than ever, and it didn't take long for me to realize that they were all trying to keep me away from what was happening. My phone rang less, conversations were shorter, and there was always this feeling that something was about to explode. That morning, something strange happened. During a patrol, I noticed that the radio was interfering more than usual. A constant static. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. The central station was miles away, but even so, the interference persisted. I tried calling someone on the radio, but no one responded. The strangest part was that, when I moved away from certain areas, the static lessened, but whenever I got close to those clearings, the sound grew louder, as if the park was reacting to me. I didn't know what to think anymore. I was on the brink of madness, isolating myself from the few colleagues who still seemed to care. And the conversations with others grew stranger. It was as if there was a conscious effort not to mention what was happening. No one spoke about what I had seen in the clearing anymore, and no one seemed willing to help me understand what was happening to me. It was then that I began reviewing my own notes. The notes about the disappearances of animals, the strange patterns I had recorded earlier, the stories Mike and the others had told me. I started connecting the dots. Every case, every clue, seemed to converge to something deeper, darker. I found myself obsessively staring at the disappearance records. There was something in them that was eluding me, something I hadn't noticed before. The pattern wasn't just about where or when the animals had disappeared, but about the types of animals. They were always the loners, the ones who strayed from the rest of the pack, the ones who seemed to isolate themselves. It was as if some invisible force was drawing them, pulling them away from the group, leading them off to where? To what? It was late at night when I decided to review the records from past years. While going through the documents, I found an interesting note in an older report. It mentioned something about an event, an occurrence that had taken place many years before, something related to a series of disappearances that were never resolved, but strangely connected to a series of communication failures at the central station. Those disappearances, although never officially documented, were buried, as if no one wanted to remember them. That was when I realized Everything I had observed up until then was no coincidence. I was being drawn into something much bigger than I could have imagined. When I went to the central station that night, once again, I was confronted with furtive and nervous glances from everyone. The answers were vague. I could no longer trust anyone. I didn't know who to trust. It was as if everyone had been consumed by the same thing that was consuming me. Fear, uncertainty. I decided to do something impulsive. By the end of that night, I went to the file room. No one was there. Only the shadows danced on the walls under the dim light of the lamps. I walked over to the old files and started searching through them until I found an old box, buried in a remote corner. When I opened it, I found more papers that hadn't been seen in years. Reports, old photographs, and something that seemed like a handwritten letter. The letter was dated decades ago, but its handwriting seemed strangely familiar. It spoke about an incident in which the administration had covered up the death of a park ranger who had gotten lost in the same areas I had been investigating. The words in the letter were unsettling. He saw what he shouldn't have seen. The truth no one can know. The forest. The forest does not forget. The words hammered in my mind as I tried to understand what they meant. What had happened to that ranger? What had he seen? And why now was I beginning to understand that something very similar was happening to me? The facts were becoming clearer, but my mind was no longer fully connected to reality. I was making irrational, thoughtless decisions. I began reviewing everything, searching for patterns, trying to make connections where there might not have been any. The search for the truth was consuming me. That was when things started to spiral out of control. The people around me began to notice my obsession. I was distracted at work, and my friends, who had once been my support line, were now pulling away. I could feel it. During a conversation with Mike, he looked at me with an expression of pure concern. "Eric, you need to stop. It's consuming you. You can't keep going like this. There's nothing more you can do. You're going too far." I wanted to shout at him, tell him he was wrong, but I knew he was right. I was completely out of control. I couldn't stop. I couldn't. I no longer knew what I was looking for, but I knew I had to keep going. Time was running out. The nights grew longer and quieter, and I felt myself sinking deeper into those mysteries that were dragging me into an endless abyss. I became even more obsessed. I started diving into every possible source, searching for answers that seemed non-existent. I spent hours on online forums where mysterious people shared their experiences with disappearances and unexplained phenomena. Sometimes I found something that seemed useful, but most of it was just empty chatter, unfounded theories. However, there was one story that stood out. It was an old, almost forgotten post from someone who claimed to have worked in the park years ago and recounted something bizarre, something that connected to the disappearances I had read about. Sometimes the forest takes what doesn't belong. Not always do you leave alive, the post said. The fear in that person's words was palpable, but what really caught my attention was the mention of a name, Dylan Carmichael. The name meant nothing to me, but after a quick search, I discovered he was an old park ranger, missing around the same time other animals began to mysteriously vanish. He had been declared dead, but no one knew what really happened to him. There were no clear records of his death, only vague assumptions. And that was my first concrete clue. The next night, I went to the cemetery where Dylan Carmichael was supposed to be buried. The discomfort was overwhelming, as if the earth itself was weighing down on me. The gravestones were old, covered in moss, and the area was darker than I had expected, as if the place were avoided by those who knew more than they were willing to tell. I found Dylan's grave, and what I found there left me even more perplexed. The gravestone was broken, and the earth around it seemed to have been disturbed recently. But there were no clear signs that anyone had visited. It was then that something strange happened. As I got closer, I heard a sound. It wasn't clear at first, just a whisper. I backed up a little, trying to understand what was going on. I looked around, but saw no one. The sound persisted, a faint crackling, almost like a breath through the leaves, but it wasn't natural. It wasn't the sound of nature. I realized then that my mind was beginning to form a much more complex picture. Maybe the forest, or whatever was at the center of it all, was somehow calling people. And what made me think this was the connection between Dylan Carmichael and the disappearances. I felt as if I had been drawn to this place, as if I had been chosen to see something. I returned to the office, and that night, I went back to the old records. Finding more clues was becoming a necessity. I was scouring everything, even the little notes that had been left aside. One of them, dated many years ago, mentioned something about a renewal ritual. The words were smudged, as if the document had been censored, but I still managed to read something about a presence that returns, something that seemed related to the cycle of the disappearances. With that, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a mystery of animal disappearances, nor with a simple, isolated case. I was dealing with something ancient, something that went back decades, something that might have been set in motion long before I arrived. And the feeling that consumed me, the idea that my life was being directed by invisible forces, now seemed like an indisputable truth. I needed more than ever to understand what was really happening, and at the same time, I was beginning to realize that I couldn't continue this path alone. My obsession was affecting my sanity, but it was stronger than any rationality. I needed to uncover the truth, even if it cost me everything. I contacted an old colleague, a specialist in natural phenomena, who studied the mysteries of forests and the forces nature could harbor. He hesitated at first, but over time, he agreed to help me, though he still seemed skeptical about my conclusions. What he brought to the conversation was revealing. The forest is not a place to play around, Eric. There are things that we're not meant to understand. It was as if he was trying to prepare me for what was to come. The pieces started to fall into place, but I didn't know what to do with the answers. What was happening was bigger than everything I had imagined, and at the same time, it was closer to me than I could have ever anticipated. I no longer knew where the search ended and the despair began. Each day seemed longer, more exhausting, and the idea of an imminent revelation consumed me. The investigation into Dylan Carmichael, the disappearances, and the forces that seemed to haunt the forest no longer allowed me to rest. Each clue I followed led me to a dead end, and each step seemed to drag me further into a territory where logic and reason no longer held power. But there was something more, something I hadn't fully realized until that moment. I found myself in a dilemma. I needed answers, but I knew those answers would likely not be pleasant. On one of the quietest nights, after days of relentless research, I went once more to the abandoned cabin where Dylan Carmichael had lived. Years ago, there was something there, something wrong, something calling me, and I needed to understand what it was. As if that cabin had been designed to hide secrets. I still didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I felt like I was close. When I reached the cabin, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The place was almost exactly as I remembered, but there was a subtle change. The marks on the wood, the cracks in the walls, everything felt more present. It was as if the place was watching me. Inside the cabin, I found what I hadn't expected. In a corner, there was a notebook, old but legible, that seemed to have been left there by Dylan. I opened it, hesitantly, and read the first few pages. It was a mix of loose notes and disconnected accounts. But one sentence stood out immediately. I started seeing what they saw. Now it's too late to turn back. The notebook was full of sentences like that. Descriptions that seemed increasingly delirious, as if Dylan was being consumed by something invisible, something he couldn't control. One sentence, in particular, made my stomach turn. They're watching me now. I know they are. I can't trust anyone, not even what I see. From there, the reading became more confusing and distressing. Dylan mentioned something about a ritual, something that happened every cycle of nature, and how he had tried to escape it. He didn't speak clearly about what it was, but he seemed to refer to the presence of an entity, something greater than he or I could understand. What shocked me was the name he mentioned at the end of every entry, the Guardian. I didn't know what that meant, but something in my mind was connecting the dots. The Guardian. The name echoed in my head, and everything around me seemed to distort, as if the very environment was reacting to that word. I left the cabin, and the air felt heavier than ever. I was at a point of no return. I looked at the trees around me, as if I were being watched. Every sound of nature seemed amplified, as if the very shadows were alive, alert. I needed answers. I needed to know what this Guardian was, and more importantly, what I could do to stop what seemed like an immutable, deadly cycle. But there was a problem. The person I thought could help me was now further from me than ever. My colleague, the expert in natural phenomena, had pulled away. He no longer wanted to get involved, but before he stopped answering my messages, he left one last warning. Don't go any deeper, Eric. You're messing with something you can't understand. The forest demands a price. I was overcome with frustration. It felt like everything was conspiring to keep me from the truth. But the truth was out there, and I was determined to find it, no matter the cost. I spent the following days trying to understand what the Guardian represented. Every search, every conversation seemed to lead me to a dead end. But one thing was clear. I was closer to something than ever, and it wouldn't make sense for me to turn back now, not after everything. The answers were within my reach. Time seemed to drag on. I was tired, exhausted, but I couldn't stop. I could no longer distinguish what was real from what was the result of my disturbed mind. But one thing was certain. Something was coming. Something I could no longer avoid. I decided to go back into the forest. That was the only thing that still made sense. Deep down, I knew the answer was there. There was no more delaying. Dylan's visions, my colleague's warnings, everything was converging on one point. The presence of the Guardian. Whatever it was tied to the heart of the forest and to what I had lost sight of. The night was dark, dense, when I reached the point where everything had begun. It was no longer just a simple walk. I was heading to meet what I knew awaited me. Every step was an internal struggle, a mix of fear and determination. The trees around me were tall, imposing, but there was something different about them. As if they were moving, slightly, with each gust of wind. The shadows seemed to distort in a disconcerting way, and I knew I wasn't alone. As I moved forward, a sense of discomfort took over me. Something was lurking. The sound of my steps seemed muffled, as if the very earth was trying to silence me. Then I saw it. There ahead, in a clearing in the forest, a figure was standing. It was an indistinct silhouette, but there was no doubt it was a presence. The figure was motionless, and its eyes, if it was indeed a person, seemed to glow with an unusual intensity. They were watching me without saying a word. I knew, deep down, that it wasn't human. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure, without moving, seemed to know exactly what I was thinking, why I was there, what I was meant to discover. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded strange, as if it had been swallowed by the darkness around me. Who are you? The figure didn't respond immediately. The silhouette seemed to emanate a dense, heavy energy, a force that paralyzed me. Finally, it moved, but slowly, as if each motion was measured, premeditated. Then the words came, soft, almost whispered, but with immeasurable weight. I am the Guardian, and you already know enough. The words echoed in my mind, making my body tremble. Those words. I had read them in Dylan's notebook, but now they carried a much greater weight. The truth was there, before me, and I didn't know whether to feel relief or terror. What is happening here? What do you want from me? I tried to ask, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. The guardian didn't respond right away. Instead, it took a step forward, and I felt something change. The air became denser, and a sense of disorientation overcame me. I looked at it, and I could see it wasn't a man, nor a human figure. It was a presence, an entity that transcended the body. Its eyes, or what I imagined were its eyes, were fixed on me. This isn't about you, Eric. It never was. You are never anything more than a piece in this game. Those words hit me like a sharp blade. A piece in the game. That explained so much. The feeling that everything was already predestined. That there was never really a choice. That my investigation, my search, was just a piece on a much larger board. But what I didn't know, what I still didn't fully understand, was what would happen to me now. I looked at the guardian, feeling a mix of anger and despair. I wanted to scream, I wanted to rebel, but all I could do was silently question. What do you want from me? I repeated, now in a weaker tone, but still desperate to understand. The entity smiled, a smile that didn't seem human. It was a distant smile, as if it were enjoying my inner struggle. You'll find out, but not the way you think. You already know, Eric. You already know what's at stake. What's happening here? The forest chose you, and you can't leave anymore. Before I could respond, the darkness around me seemed to expand, swallowing me whole. The guardian began to disappear, but its presence still lingered like a shadow that never fades. And then everything went silent. I don't know how long I stayed there, in that clearing, immersed in the absolute silence. When I finally regained my senses, the figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence was still alive, pulsating in the shadows that now surrounded me. Everything around me seemed sharper, yet more distant. I was in a place between the real and the unreal, between what was possible and what I should never have tried to understand. I didn't know how, but I left that place. I returned to my cabin with heavy steps and a mind still trying to process everything that had happened. Something inside me knew that my life would never be the same. The mystery that consumed me had left deep scars. Even after all the revelations, the truth was vague and nebulous, like a shadow I could never reach, but always felt in the corner of my vision. In the following days, things returned to normal, or to what I now called normal. The work at the park, the conversations with the few coworkers who remained, everything followed a monotonous routine. But something had changed in me. What had once seemed like a simple workplace was now a prison. I looked at the horizon and no longer saw the vastness of the mountains. I only saw the invisible boundaries of a mystery that would never leave me. The guardian, the entity, the things that were never said, but which I knew deep down were there. The forest was not a common place. It was something more, something that chose me, as it had said, something that, in some way, had now become a part of me, even though I didn't know how. When I thought I could rest, that I could move on, a sense of discomfort still lingered over me. I didn't know if I was searching for answers, or if I simply couldn't stop looking. Sometimes I thought I heard something at night, a whisper, a presence moving through the trees. But when I turned, it was always empty. Fear had become a part of me. No longer the fear of something unknown, but the fear that I would never fully understand what happened, what I saw, what I felt. And that uncertainty, that constant doubt, gnawed at me. My life would never be the same again, but there was no turning back. I was trapped in it. I was a piece in this game, and the rules had already been set. I knew that if I tried to escape, the forest would take me back, and I didn't know if I would have the strength to resist again. With everything that had happened, I realized that there was something even deeper that connected me to that place. Something ancient, something I still didn't fully understand. But I knew it would never be more than a shadow, a distant echo of what had already existed. The Guardian was right. I could no longer distinguish what was real from what wasn't. And perhaps it no longer mattered. I was doomed to live with this, always searching, always looking for answers that, in the end, would never come. I had already been months away from Yellowstone, trying to rebuild my life in a distant town, far from those mountains. The work, the people, the routine, everything seemed to have fallen back into place. But the feeling of something lost, something I couldn't identify, was always there. I didn't know if what I had lived through was real, or if my mind had simply collapsed in that place. The line between the real and the unreal had become too thin, and now everything felt like a blur. Today, as I walked through the city, a news story caught me by surprise. Someone had disappeared in the Yellowstone Mountains. The story didn't come with many details, just a vague mention, a case lost in the investigations. But the name paralyzed me. A park ranger, and something in the story. Something about how he disappeared, how his story was erased, made me remember those lonely nights in the forest. I stopped reading. The yellowed newspaper shook in my hands. My breath grew heavy. Could I have been next? The answer, as always, is out there. In the shadows, in those mountains that still call to me, still watch me. I know what I saw, I know what I felt. But at the same time, I can no longer trust my own perception. The fear that the truth will never be fully revealed is what torments me now, because I know that, somehow, it is still out there, and in some way, it knows that I am still looking for it. I close my eyes, and for a moment, I can hear the trees calling my name,